If you find yourself presenting with this type of posture with your lower back and maybe your hips feeling stiff, and no matter how many couch stretches or hip flexor stretches you do, the problem just doesn't seem to go away, then this video will be for you. So although doing some form of hip flexor stretch might give you some form of short-term relief, if you notice that when you go to move, that tightness just keeps coming back, we have to start asking why that might be. And one of the primary reasons in my experience is people not having the ability to get genuine hip extension. Now, what does that mean? That means that when I'm coming up and forward, can I actually extend my hips or my pelvis before my knee? As an example, if you were to go into a lunge right now, and you can do this with me, get into a split stance position, go down, and as you come up, can you track, or does it feel intuitive for you to move your hips on top of your knee before the knee extends? If you can't, then there is a good chance that when you actually go to move, you are not performing or getting adequate hip extension. And what this can lead to over time is a sense of rigidity through the hips, the feeling of them always feeling like they're tight, and they need to be opened up in a variety of ways. But we can actually start to train this pattern in exercise. Now let's do exactly that. Come back into your lunge position here. And what I want you to start to get familiar with is that as you're standing up, think about halfway, you're gonna start to take your weight or your center of mass forward. And I want you to notice how my knee is actually staying bent while we're getting used to the hips coming on top of that. What we're gonna get familiar with is coming down into a lunge. We're gonna hang out here for about 1 to 2 seconds. We're gonna do a smooth press through the floor. And your sense of how you're gonna go about this is trying to get your hips on top of your knee. This is gonna be the angle that you're kind of looking for. We're trying to avoid that when you're coming up, you're just doing knee extension. You wonder why you're so quad dominant? It's because when you go through these types of exercises, you're just reinforcing that same pattern and conditioning around the quad muscles. And now when you look at my pelvis, where is it? I'm actually still in flexion because I've gone into so much knee extension. So a really easy way to start to introduce this is through the lunge, delaying the knee extension, and getting used to the hips tracking on top. It doesn't have to be a specific rep range amount here, but I would encourage you to go through anywhere between about 8 to 15 reps, about a 3-second down phase to a 3-second up phase. Again, getting used to the hips tracking on top of the knee. So now that you've got somewhat familiar with this deep lunge position, getting used to hip extension on top of the knee, let's work through a way to go through that more dynamically or with some rhythm. Because we don't live statically and just holding tension the whole time, not that that isn't important, and you can certainly start to introduce load to the previous exercise, we do want to start to give the body an idea of how to go through movement in a rhythmic and dynamic fashion, as that tends to relate or align a little bit more closely to how we interact with gravity and just reality on a day-to-day basis. So for this, you can grab a kettlebell. You can also use a dumbbell, anything that's gonna give you some feedback. And we're gonna come back into that same split stance position. And again, I want you to notice the shin angle that I have on this right side. It's more or less right on top of my midfoot. I'm not in front of the toes, but I'm also not behind the ankle. We're kind of just chilling on top of the midfoot. And what we're gonna work through is a swing to the outside of this hip while our knee stays more or less fixed the entire time. So this knee isn't gonna be shifting back and forth too much. We're gonna try to have some relative stability around the knee while the pelvis becomes the primary driver of motion. So what this is gonna look like is I'm gonna work a swing, and I'm just gonna get familiar with what that rhythm feels like as the hips are coming forward and that knee is staying more or less fixed in space. Now I have a decent weight on here, so I am really feeling a lot of feedback around things like my hamstrings, glutes, even getting some adductors and quads in there as well. And what this is allowing us to work through is not only that phase of hip extension, but we're also getting used to going into a pretty significant degree of flexion and rotation. So if your hips are feeling rigid or bound up, this is a great exercise to not only further condition this patterning, but also open the hips up in a more dynamic way. And this for me is one of my favorite exercises to work through to really get the hips primed and get them familiar with being that primary driver to movement. There's some huge muscles around here. So we want to think about how can we access those muscles to actually perform our movement on a larger scale. You can imagine that if I'm getting tightness in through my glute med, glute min, TFL, that's always feeling tight, then chances are you're probably not getting A, enough movement through there, and B, the bigger primary muscles aren't doing the job that they should. And this is a great way to start to introduce that feedback. For this, I would work through anywhere between about 8 to 12 reps if you're using some load. If you're using, say, 5 to 8 pounds, I'd go anywhere between about 15 to 18, and you can use this more as a warm-up or just a way to kind of bring some mobility back into the pelvis. Anyways, that is going to wrap this week's video on how to genuinely improve your hip extension. Again, there is nothing wrong with a more passive intervention if you do find that it creates some length through the hip flexor, but we also want to be mindful of some of the larger contributors and how that relays into our movements, and maybe how we can introduce that into our exercise routine. And lastly, while you're here, the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll enjoy this video that I did on the body in some way, so why not go check that out? Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you there.